Hello, welcome. My name is Solana Chetman. I'm the Director of Creative Practice and Social Impact here at The Shed, and I want to welcome you all From Arachnophobia to Arachnophilia, our fourth encounter as part of our ongoing conversation series, Matters for Conversation and Action, taking place in conjunction with the exhibition Particular Matters by artist Tomás Saraceno, on view at The Shed through April 17th. I want to start, as always, by sharing the points of access that are available today. Live closed captioning is provided by Marie Villarreal. To turn it on, please click the CC button in the bottom right of your Zoom window. We also have American Sign Language interpretation provided by Lavender de Julia and Selena Flowers, who should be visible at all times. And please feel free to connect with our team with any comments or requests regarding your participation through the chat feature to the right of the screen. And please also feel free to add your questions for the panelists throughout the conversation using the Q&A button that's also at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will try to get to most of them towards the end of our discussion. We organized this series, Matters for Conversation and Action, as a way to dig deeper into Saraceno's work, and at the same time as a way to center some of the main contemporary discussions related to the climate crisis, including the human-made capitalist-driven non-livability of our planet, its disparate impacts on different populations, particularly taking on environmental racism and soon on indigenous stewardship of the land. And throughout it all, what we can do individually and collectively to enact change, how we can collaborate in a multi and transdisciplinary way, and what we can learn from different practices, knowledges, and from each other. This way of working resonates quite a bit with the work that Saraceno has been doing with the Arachnophilia community, an interdisciplinary network of spiderweb enthusiasts that seeks to weave a relationship between scientific, philosophical, cultural images and stories that describe the entangled relations between humans and spiders over thousands of years. In this same spirit, today's conversation invites a group of amazing and multidisciplinary speakers to share their own practices, not only researching and understanding, but also learning from, valuing, paying homage, and actively collaborating with spiders in building, in weaving a safer and more equitable future for our planet. We couldn't be more grateful to our outstanding set of international speakers for joining us today. Marcus J. Buehler is the McAfee Professor of Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Director of MIT's Laboratory for Atomistic and Molecular Mechanics. Peggy Hill is an ecologist and Professor Emerita of Biological Science at the University of Tulsa. Eric Paul Ridge is an artist based in Nonhuman, Gallup, New Mexico, working across media with an emphasis on woven sculpture, wearable art, and durational performance. David Setlin is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oxford's Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology. And finally, our moderator, Cynthia Willett, is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Philosophy at Emory University. Before having them join, I want to thank our partners, the Columbia Climate School and the Studio Saraceno, for the co-conspiration in putting together this series. And I want to thank very especially Ford Foundation for supporting and making this series possible. I want to invite you all to check out our website, theshed.org, for more information about upcoming conversations, for recording of past ones if you missed them, and to get tickets to come see the exhibition in person if you're in New York. And if you have any young people in your life, I would love to also invite you to check in on our By Teens for Teens programs, with a special shout out to A Science Affair, an event that will take place at the Shed on Saturday, April 2nd, and that is free for everyone to participate in. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Alex Schroeder from Columbia's Climate School. And then I'll ask Alex that you pass it on to Marcus, Peggy, Eric, Paul, David, and Cynthia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Solana. And hello, everyone. My name is Alex, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Initiatives at the Columbia Climate School. I've had the great pleasure to work closely with Solana and the SHED team to shape this public programming series, which connects to and builds on the incredible and thought-provoking art of Tomás Saraceno. So thank you to both the SHED and Studio Saraceno for your inspiration and hard work on both this exhibit and the event series. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight on behalf of the Columbia Climate School. Our school aims to provide the scholarship needed to tackle the climate crisis and related problems. And we also have a huge emphasis on interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary partnerships. And this public program series is a truly great example of the power of interdisciplinary collaborations and partnerships. These discussions bring together a diversity of panelists to explore a range of critical topics connected to climate change, the environment, and environmental justice. So on that note, thank you to everyone for joining tonight. I'm pleased to hand it off to tonight's moderator, Cynthia, and the other panelists. So thank you again and enjoy this panel.
Thank you, Solana, and thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm especially excited for this conversation with Tomás's collaborators on his larger vision. And the focus of our conversation today is on what we might learn by attuning ourselves to other species. This is also a question that's been very interesting for me in philosophy because of our overemphasis on reason and language as seemingly unique to humans. It's this overemphasis that obscures possibilities for ethics and for knowledge, the kind of possibilities that come from being more open to attuning ourselves to tones and rhythms, vibrations, all that makes for that kind of rich nonverbal communication, the kind of communication that doesn't make humans in some ways exceptional, but that we share with many other species. It's through these attunements that we might feel our way into another creature's life, despite fundamental differences between us. I'd like to start, David, with your work. Your work has taught us a great deal about spider divination. These are traditional practices in Cameroon and elsewhere. It seems like in modern cultures, we've lost anything like these practices, that we've stripped ourselves of communicative channels between us and other creatures. And we've lost as well our sense of the divine. But it's also commonly said that in secular cultures, art has replaced religion. In fact, as we see from the collaboration in the SHED, it's not just artists, but also scientists. And Marcus, here I'm thinking of your work as well. Artists, engineers, you all are in some sense are diviners. I'd love to know what it is that you all think we need to hear now, if we could only reopen channels of communication across species. And David, if you could start by explaining to us what you have learned from spider divination practices.
Thank you so much. So I come at this from a slightly different point, I think, from most of the other panelists, because I'm a cultural anthropologist. I work in a small village in Cameroon in West Africa, near the Cameroon-Nigerian border. And I've been working with people like Bolo and Tamgo, who you can see on the screen here, for nearly 35 years. And what I love about spider divination is the way that it makes people make their concerns explicit, because to do divination, you put a stone and a stick near the hole of in which these earth-living spiders live in, and you associate different questions with the stone and the stick. Here are some examples. So when I was last in the village, actually with Tomás Saraceno in late 2019, one of the questions we asked was about the upcoming American election. And the thing about making it binary, because you've only got one stone, one stick, is it doesn't force you can still leave questions open. So we are able to say, if the Americans will choose the current president chose the stone, if they will choose a new one, not saying who that new one would be, choose the stick. And often in divination, you leave an open option associated with one of the two poles. And if that is chosen, you can then ask subsequent questions. And you can, so looking at the flow of questions, a sequence, it gives a real idea of how particular concerns are elaborated and investigated. So it's a way of studying indigenous intellectual activity. And I just point out that this is a very rare photograph showing what I like to think of as a mother spider teaching a baby spider how to divine. But you can't actually tell the genders. One of the other things that's come out of this is that with Thomas, we've now got a website coming out of his visit, and it's possible for other people to ask, to send questions to the village when there will be a delay, but I can interpret what people want to ask to the diviners, such as Bolo, who you saw earlier, and eventually I can give you an answer back. And it's about externalizing, it's about losing control in a constrained way. That's the main set of lessons that I've learned from it.
Yeah, very interesting. Would anyone like to add something here? Because Peggy, I think of your work and it's very interestingly focused on vibrations. In fact, you've really taught us how channels of communication might be opened by attending to vibrations. When I laid in the giant web that Tomás installed at the shed, I felt through its vibrations some sense of what it was like to be alive for a spider, or at least that's what I thought I felt. It's not as though I felt like I was becoming, in any sense, a spider. It was more that there was this way in which I felt like I felt that spider sense of aliveness next to my own. It's something like when I give a friend a tight embrace and I can feel their heartbeat, their pulse against mine. And I even can feel their mood or sense, in a way, get a sense of things for them. Peggy, could you explain how vibrations work and their significance for spiders?
Peggy, I think you're muted.
Excuse me. I thank you, but this is a tall order, and I'll do my best to convey as much information as I can that's really pertinent to the discussion in the shortest time. But first of all matter in our universe is in motion. Everything vibrates. So vibrational behavior, which we study in this new scientific discipline of bioetymology, to the best of our knowledge, evolved along with the evolution of animals after sponges. So we're talking billion years ago. The vibrations used in this behavior are produced with any movement, but also created by animals as particle motion in mechanical waves rather than individual vibrating bits of matter. So the things that we're looking at are waves of vibration. Okay, so animals communicate with mates or offspring, colony members. They warn off predators with vibrations that they create through specific mechanisms. 3 of the 4 most common ways of producing vibrations by animals all require the evolution of special structures. Were already functioning at least 230 million years ago. So 3 of the 4 ways that animals these days produce vibrations were already being used 230 million years ago. And only 2 types of waveforms of all those out there are used across the planet in almost all known examples of animal communication and other vibrational behavior. There are other mechanical waveforms, but we've just not yet found whether they're associated with vibrational behavior, but they may be. So use of vibration in communication and avoidance of predation and more is incredibly ancient on the planet. Signals have been refined and specialized along with the development of receiver organs to detect these vibrations. And we haven't found any major, this is key, we haven't found any major modern animal groups that do not have the ability to receive and process vibrational information. So use of the vibration really is everywhere, but not audible. Because a sound wave, which is one type of vibrational wave, is detected by ears. And sound waves are heard and detected because of pressure or differences in pressure, while substrate-borne vibrations are detected by particle displacement. And there are an immense array of receiver organs that actually are used besides ears. So sound is heard, vibration is felt. As we look at this person lying in a human constructed web that's part of the exhibition, half or more of their body is in contact with the threads of the web. And if we play back recorded vibrations through the artificial web, the human can then experience something like a spider would in the web the spider's constructed. So now this web is very regular in construction, and you can see the mesh of it is you see all these little squares with four points. Spider webs aren't exactly like this, but the concept is better understood if you have the chance to experience this human constructed web, which I think is great that Cindy was able to. So in a typical spider web, and not all spiders actually make webs, radial threads run from the center to the edge and are connected by spiral threads that intersect the radials. These threads represent the substrate from which the spider gains information. Other substrates could be things like soil or plant organs or water surface or honeycombs, but for the spider, it's the web. The spider constructs the web from material produced by its own body, and each thread is surrounded by the atmosphere above and below, but also totally around each thread. Energy travels along the web threads as mechanical vibrations and then transfers to the air surrounding the threads at the boundary automatically by exciting particle motion. At the boundary, the waveform in the web thread changes to another type of wave, in this case, sound, though probably very quiet, low amplitude sounds that would have to be artificially amplified for humans to be able to hear them. Vibrations passing along a web thread, whether produced by a spider or struggling prey or a predator of the spider or a potential mate or even offspring, each has its own identifiable vibrational signature. And so information, whether intentional or not, can be detected and understood, perceived by the spider, the web's owner. The resident spider can then respond to a mate or its babies or a meal, or stop moving to conceal itself from the predator. It doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination for us to consider the spiders being able to gain information and share it with other species at this boundary between its web threads and the air that surround the threads. But we do not yet know that this happens, simply that it's theoretically possible. Communication, as it's currently defined, has to involve information exchange. We know that all life forms can detect vibrations and that we are surrounded by these vibrations unless we insulate ourselves. So if interspecies communication of information is beneficial to life forms, if it's beneficial, it's already happening because of evolution through natural selection. We have simply not yet detected this information exchange or been aware of its potential existence for long enough for humans to be able to decode it we're still studying information transfer within a species or in a predator-prey interaction, but we're making huge progress. So maybe is my answer. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And, and thinking, Peggy, both of your work, that you were among the first to really be attentive to vibrations. And thinking back to David's work, that, all that you brought forward, David, about these divination practices. I wonder, Peggy, if you or any of the speakers could help us speculate on, why it is that we have become so distracted in modern cultures, distracted from these kinds of, I guess, attunements to vibrations. Is there something that's blocked our attention to it? Is there something we could do to overcome, that blocking and be more attentive? Yeah, David.
Thank you. I'm not sure that that characterization is right. Loads of people are doing all sorts of different forms of divination. It's massively disapproved of and therefore kind of kept to one side. So, going from tarot cards, the I Ching, in lots of European places, there's a tradition of reading tea leaves or coffee grounds. And these are kind of external props for thought. Another way of thinking about it is boundary objects, if you want technical terminology. But there's an awful lot going on. There's more going on than you're allowing for, is all I'd say. Interesting.
And Peggy, you were telling us too something also about, like, in our lives are too fast paced, and that maybe it's a matter of paying more attention.
Well, since I'm from Oklahoma, I have to mention something about the Native perspective. Mm-hmm. And Luther Standing Bear, who's not from Oklahoma, who's a Lakota, in the 1930s wrote about reclining on the earth to be able to gain information and balance from the earth, of elders seeking from the earth for the earth to teach them by being in physical contact with it. And there is sort of a respect specifically for spiders, for their patience and their work ethic in stories of many tribes. But one thing that I think is kind of key for this question, Cherokee storytellers in the area where I live often start a teaching story with the statement, a long time ago when animals could talk. And so there still is that, I agree with David, there still is this practice out in the real world, but we humans in advanced civilizations have traded what we think is superiority and being able to live forever by giving up living in harmony with the world. We for most of the history of humans, we lived as members of the community, as part of life. But beginning with agriculture and then industry, then technology, we gave that up and removed ourselves, from living in that area. And the idea is, to me, we don't have to give up everything we've acquired in knowledge to the present, but we have to relearn how to live in a world where we respect all other things, where we see a life form and we kill it because it's not a human, sort of thing. You've got to be able to live with respect for, and it's not just other animals, it's fungi and, bacteria, all that kind of thing. Not everything is a threat. But we've forgotten how to do that because we're invincible and we're more important than we're dominating the planet and in it with all the destruction that we see from that. So if we individually, we could just, sort of maybe almost like meditating or going through mindfulness, we could just be silent and feel what's going on in our environment, and it slows our it slows our heart rate, our blood pressure goes down, we feel more rested, all these kinds of things. But it's, we are a life form on this planet, and we have kind of said, but we're more superior. And I think if we pay attention to the world, we can regain so much knowledge and spiritual sort of, well-being and artistic, vigor. Those of us who are not really very artistic can still achieve something from just listening.
Very, very interesting. Eric Paul, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to jump off of that, to weave with those statements, I suppose. There was something that David said that I feel like as a weaver and as a maker, and having to co-inhabit space not only with the people around me, but the places that you're gifted to grow up in, or the more than human and non-human beings that also co-inhabit your space. I feel like the image that you showed you said it was like a mother spider in some sort of way teaching a baby spider how about divination and about what it means to exist. So I always feel like when I introduce myself, I should introduce some of my family. So this is my great-grandmother who was a weaver. Here's me as a little baby. She lived to be about 106. And so I had a relationship with her until she passed. But I feel like as I have come to make, and as I have come to, see myself as an artist, I think about my mothers being, my mother herself, her mother, her grandmother, so that my great grandmother, then also the mothers of our holy figures. So Na'esh Je'i Edzah, which is Diné for Spider Woman, who is the holy figure who taught us as Diné how to weave. So she passed that down to two other holy figures, and then this passing down and this relationship between hand and craft and storytelling, for me is one, beautiful, but also provides physical survival. And I was thinking about what Peggy said about spiders. Their bodies literally take their homes with them. Their home is within their body. And so I feel like my home is within my own body. I've taken that relationship between how you inhabit the world and how you go through the world from the idea of the spider. I feel as when I perform, there is a matter of slowing down. And so we're talking about what it means to be, what it means to, be mindful. And so I feel like one other thing that Peggy said, that all matter is in motion. And so in some ways I consider one of my passions, the passion of weaving, but another passion of mine is motion, what it means to be still, what it means to run, what it means to, have repetitive motion, because at the loom, it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. There's a slow, minuscule growth of the yarn and the warp, millimeter by millimeter. And so it's one very patience building. My dad's not very patient, so I often tell him, I need to teach you how to weave, so that way we can slow down together and really attune ourselves to the relationship with the loom. But I think about that passion of motion, of this slow, minuscule growth, and that's what the spider is with the home. It's a slow, minuscule growth of their bodies creating their home. And so for me as a weaver, my home is when I am at the loom and when I am also creating and weaving a web.
Yeah, that is so interesting. It's so interesting to think of your own art of weaving as, in a way, like building those kind of connections that are also home. And, and I think of like the contrast that your art, which is really beautiful, poses with the kind of art that comes from more individualistic cultures, that your art really is this art of densely woven connection with past and futures, and with ancestors, and with human and non-humans. And, in philosophy, we're very familiar with ancient Greeks who developed their arts and their oracles to warn against hubris. And hubris was the violation, the destruction of webs of connectedness. And they used their arts which are also their religion. They use their arts as their medicine. And I wonder if you could tell me more about this aspect of your art. Are there cathartic practices that you know that can help us clear not just those physical pollutants in the air, but also the toxins in our ways of being? Are there healing practices that might reweave webs of connection? In other words, can art heal? Or even looking at towards Marcus's work, does it have therapeutic value?
Yeah, I for myself, when I'm thinking about what it means to make as a mode of healing, or as even thinking about ecology and the science of connections and the web making conversations that we have, what is it? How does my art, or how does art in general fit into this conversation? And I relate that back to our gestures as we're in conversation and language right now, but in nonverbal language, what are the most kind gestures that we can do for each other? And I consider carrying the most kind gesture that humans have for other beings. We carry someone's hands are too full, so you help them with their groceries. You're carrying their groceries from the car to the kitchen counter. Someone is injured, and so now you are carrying them to the hospital, whether that's physically your body or to the vehicle. Now the car is carrying you, but you are driving the vehicle. I think about someone telling you a secret, and now you are carrying that secret for them, or carrying a burden. I think about you're in love with someone, and now you're carrying your lover to bed, or carrying your baby to bed. I think about the loom as a means of weaving and carrying stories. And so for me, the healing gesture there is protection. I think about the utilitarian use of blankets. They're to keep you warm. They're to keep the floor softer for you, for your feet. They're to keep you dry if it's raining. They're there to protect you. And so I think about carrying and this layer of protection between the fibers of the rugs and the blankets. And for me, that healing gesture comes into, a celebration of that within itself, but then also the cradling and the caring. As the Net people, we, as we're born, we're in a cradle board. So actually right behind me, this figure that lives within my work, he's in a cradle board. I consider him my son in a lot of ways, because I did a series of performances where within a web and within conversations that I've had with Spider Woman, and at the end of those performances, Halon, which is his name, which means to exist, was born. And so now he is in his cradle board, which is also the loom. And so, yeah, cradling and caring for me is through art is the most meaningful way to heal oneself and to heal those that are viewers or audience members or collaborators.
Yes. Yeah. And Marcus, I'd really love for you to add to this. I want to think of your work too. How, when we began the conversation, we began thinking about how in a secular world without gods, artists have become in some ways our diviners, and that artists can find meanings in the modern age of reason has left as a world that is what philosophers sometimes describe as disenchanted, that is just a world stripped of vital forces. But your work, studies not just vibrations in animals and spider webs, but also in molecules and proteins, and transforms those into audible sound, into music. It's through your collaboration that we hear the silent songs of the spiders and Tomás's webs. You've pointed out that music carries emotional meanings. Do you think there could be some rudimentary communication between us and invertebrates like spiders? And if you do, how could you speculate a bit on, how would that work?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Cynthia. So I want to start maybe by connecting this a little bit with Eric Paul's really great, discussion on weaving. I think we think of weaving as the process by which information when we go back to the level of molecules and DNA and information really stored in an organism in the world, how that information is actually folded into three-dimensional structures, materials in the end that you can see and touch. And so spider webs are the one example by which such information is actually realized. So information becomes matter in that way. And the DNA in the spider's body interacts with the environment, wherever the spider builds the web, to express itself in materials. So that's sort of the basis. Now, mechanistically, it comes back to your question, this all works actually through vibrations, which are localizations of energy. So Peggy made a great point that all species use this. And I think there are sort of distinctions in how we look at vibrations in our work. One is that you have vibrations of a string, which is sort of a non-living material in some way, a sense, at least understood by most people to be non-living. We don't know what other things are in that setting, actually. We can ask those questions. But generally, they're inactive producers of vibrations, and then they're active ones. And the spider is one of them, and we're one of them. And I think, what we're trying to see is that we carry insights into these expressions. Okay, so we can talk vibrations. The spider will vibrate the web, and you can experience that through Tomás's amazing work and how you can feel a little bit like a spider lives. But what we're trying to do is to use vibrations, or go back to that level of information carrying and how it mechanistically works through localization of energy and time and spreading it out in the world. But asking the question, how can we understand the additional messages carried in these signals? And that's really where the cross-species communication comes in. If you want to understand how the spider speaks, we're going to have to learn that language. And the same way, the spider will not understand necessarily what we have to say. And so there's this connection that we need to make. And this is where a lot of theory and mathematics comes in to actually make that happen. And so you mentioned the work we're doing on creating sounds and music and compositions from all sorts of vibrational subjects, whether it's fire, or it might be a spider, or it might be a protein, a molecule. There's some really incredible information carried that we can take over from the signals and then translate them into frequencies. And this is what Peggy mentioned as well. We can hear, and we're not special in a sense. We have special ears that work for us, right? If we want to hear other signals and understand them, we're going to have to go to different methods to actually translate them. And this is what we do a lot in our work. But that being said, I think there's sort of this universality in vibrations. And you asked about the emotional aspect of music. So, for example, that really is, I think, a function of the human creation of that. Okay, so we produce that music. We have the emotional response. What I'm interested in is that, yes, but also where it actually originates from and what information does it actually carry. So a lot of the work recently, we've extracted meaning, and I sort of asked the question, what information is carried, especially material information? So we know that the DNA in the spider will produce the web ultimately when the spider is alive and goes out in the environment. But what if you take music that humans have created and we find it, say, for example, emotional, but that's more than that. What material would you be able to make from that? So we've translated human-made compositions into material, and proteins in particular, and DNA. But we can go the other way around. That's sort of the more traditional way we've done it over the years, is to basically take existing structures like the spider web with Tomás and fire, I mentioned, and all sorts of vibrating objects in the world, including silk proteins and so on, and try to ask the question, how would they sound like? But I want to emphasize information goes both ways. And I think once you have this mechanism, it becomes a human experience. So it's not just a mathematical abstraction or computational method, but we really like to put the human experience in that mix so you can actually communicate. It's all about that experience. And that really brings, I think, adds a lot of richness to the world. I think if you're beginning to understand how objects, systems, living systems at different scales, how they express themselves and what meaning they're trying to convey. And this is, I guess, very early, for us to understand that. But yeah, there's lots there, I think. And, both from a science and artistic point of view, and the question of just where do you create new ideas that sort of challenge the paradigm by which we usually create, which is imagination in the mind, or mathematics you mentioned the Greek tradition of musical, that's really, a lot of this was based on mathematics, right? And physics, but we can go beyond that and look at different types of physics, different kinds of biology. So there's a really an incredible world out there that I think we can experience and actually enjoy, but also use it really to ask questions and to see what we don't know yet, which is really the point of science and art probably is we got to push the limits of what we know, what we think we know.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. Yeah, David.
Right, so I've remembered to unmute. Thank you so much. I'd just like to kind of make a connection between what Marcus has just been saying and what Eric was saying. I'm thinking about how conversation and the to and fro of conversation is in a sort of weaving, I'm suddenly thinking. And I've put in the chat a link to a recent paper where a colleague of mine in University College London has made a 3D model of linguistic structures. And the result is, I think, a beautiful bit of sculpture. But as a way of changing the representational form, we can also change the analytical framework. And I think there are all sorts of really powerful potentials in that, which I hope we all and the audience will explore. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Eric Paul.
That's excuse me. That's amazing. I did a project with one of my professors and mentors, Suhan Ho, who works at UNM, University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and she blessed me with so many gifts. But we did a collaboration one time about how the written language and how communication about art sometimes doesn't look like art. And when you write about art, I think it should look like the work. Whether that's through the language or through, we decided to make it visual. And so we did a project kind of similar to what you just shared, where we did a series of writings about weaving that looked like weavings. And so, yeah, I think about how communication and how the written language and the verbal back and forth relates to weaving itself, and then again the web.
Very interesting. I wonder at this point we might I like how we're weaving a conversation among ourselves too, and I wonder if we might invite those in the audience. Any questions? Is anyone out there that has a question? And meanwhile, while we wait for those questions, I'm curious if you could clarify, Marcus, when you talk about the emotional meanings of music, and that, for the human perspective, do you understand those signals, though, for, let's say, spiders, invertebrates, for those to carry something, emotional? I think of like when psychologists write about affect attunement, they think of communication, of affects, of very basic, vital emotions or feelings. And that communication happens without the creature that's communicating having any necessary conceptual understanding of what they're doing, or, anything like even a self of what we mean, but still might be communicating something that another creature, and that even maybe we could pick up, that could be, that we wouldn't understand, that always perhaps be mysterious, and yet we could still sense something of it. And I wonder if you've thought about that kind of.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do not know, actually, to be quite honest. I don't know. I think that in general, I would say that needs to be some learning. There's probably some universal features, but whether or not these relationships are intact at the moment, or if they can be learned or relearned. I mean, that's the question I would ask. If we spend more time with spiders and we have a way of actually speaking to them by exciting their webs and exposing them to signals that we have generated as humans, and then we can hear what they have to say. We can perhaps learn that there's a field in, of course, in language models. That's a very active field of research in computer science, where you do what's called fine tuning, and you have a large model that has lots of understanding of how language works. But then if you want to contextualize your model to answer a question, for example, you need to fine tune it. You need to teach it. But here's an example of what I'm actually interested in. The model will adapt and learn and self-organize its neurons to to solve that problem. And so I would probably, my answer would be, if I have to guess, I would probably say that there's probably going to be some fine-tuning necessary in that step, but I think we have the capacity for sure on both ends to do that. And perhaps the spiders in David's divination experiment, the spiders and the humans have actually either recaptured that ability or have never lost the ability, right? That maybe you and I won't have. I wouldn't have it probably, but absolutely. In general, I think the capacity is there, and we might just not have access to that at the moment. But our abilities to communicate with the environment, all the pathways are there, I think, and we would be able to learn it for sure. Yep.
And I have so interesting. I have a question too. From someone in the audience, Pretty Irani, who asks, they say that they've read an article about how Incas communicate through knots and wonder if the patterns of spider webs communicate a message, I suppose in some way analogous to that. So if you could clarify, any of you all who might be able to clarify that, Peggy or Marcus.
Well, I can go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's fine, Marcus.
No, you can go ahead. I would just, okay, I can make mine is very quick. Actually, I don't know the answer really, but the only thing I would say that we do know that spiders will construct webs depending on the environmental cues and how hungry they are, simply speaking, right? What do they feel? What's the environment like? So there's a message. And whether this message is structural, functional, or if it's communicating to other spiders, we don't necessarily know that, but we do know that some spiders live socially in social environments, and so there's clearly a communication, right? So if one spider builds part of the web in a certain way, others will pick up on this as sign cues. They will hear or see, or feel or sense, and there's got to be some communication in that way, I think. But Peggy probably has a more advanced, more vigorous answer to this question, I'm sure.
No, I don't. But I was just going to say that when we are working, as a biologist, as an ecologist, when we're working and discovering new knowledge, we just see the most obvious, right? And we can't just assume this is it. This is all of it. No. This is just a little surface, something that we happen to be able to connect with that, okay, we can learn more about, but we can never get finished with a project. Anybody that runs out of something to do in a project has no imagination. You have to just, your life is not long enough to finish all the work that you're interested in doing, right? And so I don't know about the knots. That I've always wondered, how they would send instead of a letter, they'd send a rope with knots, and how do you interpret that? Well, you have to know what you have. It has, the receiver has to know how to decode the message, right? And if if we knew how to decode more messages, we would certainly, know a lot.
Yeah, so interesting. We have a lot of interesting questions. And one of them I see raises the question of consciousness, how you all think about consciousness with respect to spiders and other living beings. And they mention also cells and fungus, which is quite interesting to think of, since we see also like these webs of communication for fungus, with trees and, cross species. Really interesting new research on that. This person wonders if you all, if in your understanding, each living being has their own language and life ways. If you all would like to speculate a bit on this larger question. Yeah, David.
Thank you. Well, a small, very specific answer to that question from Cameroon, which is that throughout the south and west of the country, divination is done with spiders. In the north of the country, it is done with land crabs. And actually, where I work with Mambilla, they use both spiders and crabs. And when you can distinguish And of course, the hole, if you look carefully at the holes of spiders are subtly different from the holes of crabs because they don't, spiders have bits of web around them. But the form of divination is the same. They use the same cards. So in that sense, both spiders and crabs, Mambilla would say, speak the same language.
Interesting. And, David, you might see there's a question here, too, that's something of a follow-up. Julia, I see, has this question. She, see if I'm reading this right, that she's been working as a ritual practitioner in her paternal tradition of Southern Italian shamanism. If you know anything about that, it seems to be based on spider divination as well. And you're wondering if there are any connections.
Yeah, the short answer is no connection. I have read a little bit about Tarantismo, but there doesn't seem to be a connection. It's like another sort of unconnection is that the Chinese I Ching and the Yoruba Fa divination, Ifa, have identical forms of notation. They use lines and broken lines, and it's all binary, and there are 2, 5, 6 alternatives. But that seems to be driven by binary logic. But otherwise, there is no connection. I'm sure there are people who would dispute that, but I'm not going to get involved. Thank you.
And very, very interesting. And let's see, there are a few other comments and questions here, including from Christine. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom and insights. It's been mind expanding and healing to see the connections between listening and healing in other species. Are there other notable species beyond spiders that you've studied and listened to? And I think you all have pointed to some of those. If there's any more that you want to say about other animals, about crabs and any other animals.
Yeah, one thing I've become really interested in recently also is not only the vibrations expressed in physical vibrations, basically, but also in motions of the animals. I mean, there's this a lot of the animals have movements, of course, and they are oftentimes also chaotic in some sense, or they have certain structure to them. And so we've been actually studying with one of my students how we could mine that data in a similar way. We've talked about the other things I'm doing to explore essentially, what are these different species and humans as well? What are we saying by how we move our bodies, our energy localized, manifestation of our DNA and everything in space, and time. And so how that could be another language, perhaps that, could be studied potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peggy.
I would just like to comment on this thing of consciousness. I have taught environmental ethics, one of the few biologists that's taught environmental ethics, but I don't accept this idea of a divide between sentient and non-sentient. I just don't, because I do feel that each life form has a life force. And they have ways that they do things that we don't understand just because we're humans. That doesn't mean, and it's like, well, I'll go there and say, okay, God tells us that we are blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, what did God tell the jellyfish? What do you suppose the jellyfish thinks about humans being, so omnipotent and so forth. And so sentient and non-sentient bothers me. But I've lost what it was I was thinking about saying. But just because we don't understand the language of these other life forms, and plants are sensitive to vibration. So if a predator is attacking a plant, an herbivore is eating the plant will release toxins that will drive them away. Or if they have a mutualism with ants, they will signal the ants to go, attack them. And so there's just a lot going on. And I think that humans have stepped out of the natural world to a certain extent, and we can step back in, but it's going to involve respect, for these life forms, respect for the soil. It's like, it's just, no, it's alive. The soil is alive, and you can't just, you're destroying it, by so many things that we do with ignorance.
Yeah, I can add something really quick to this. So 2 points. One, I think that the language is really depend on the sender and the receiver. I mean, it was mentioned, right. And that really is critical. I mean, we always take this perspective of us as receivers, and that's like I try to explain there. We have to really find a way to decode these messages and understand them. And that takes a lot because we have to put something in between that. Another thing, actually, when Peggy, you mentioned signaling, I thought about color. And that's another way to think about signals and patterning that oftentimes we don't really think about when we think about vibrations of signals. We think about spider webs and so on. But there is some great work that Joan Hepburn is doing, for example, in color and creation of all sorts of 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional systems that are essentially exploring color as a space for signaling. And I think that's something that a lot of the physical sciences have explored. And I know in biology is important, but in this intersection, at least for what I'm interested in, that's something that I'm also really, really keen on understanding the language of that, which is actually I mentioned the energy localization in my introduction. At that level, really, there's no distinction whether something's a vibrational signal or a color signal, right?
Right.
And that's really ultimately
what energy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I remembered what I wanted to say, and it's really important. There was a project at MIT working with Gallaudet University students who were congenitally deaf, right? And they attached to their fingertips these little electrodes where they could send in tones, right? So like an A or a middle C or something like that. And the students could distinguish frequency without hearing it. So they could feel the vibrations and in their brains distinguish frequency. And if they would lie down on an old disco floor and music was played through the floor, they could hear music in their brains that they really were only perceiving through vibration. So guys, we don't know very much about all of this, but it's amazing.
It is amazing.
Think about it is. What a great group, this is awesome.
I want to thank you all. This has been such a really fascinating discussion, along with this visionary project that you all have helped collaborate with. I really, I've learned from you all that vibrations have been the primary means of communication, maybe the primary means of communication for so many species for some 230 million years. And I just, you have to wonder if predates sound, hearing sound. Yeah, so you just kind of wonder if those kind of silent songs, if they and really the silent songs that you all have all helped to find, if they wouldn't re-enchant our modern lives. Thank you all. I'd like to end by thanking Alex at the Columbia Climate School, and also Solana and Sarah. The whole team at the Shed's been just fantastic through all of this. Also, all of you speakers, just really fascinating insights, as well as those of you in the audience who've joined us today.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent.